thrilled to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Hello and good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Bipartisan Policy Center for this 6th webinar in our series, Getting Serious About Housing Supply. And it's focused on the different facets of our country's housing shortage and what can be done to fix it. I'm Erica Young, I'm Associate Director here at the J. Ron Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And the center was founded to advance the goals of decent, safe, and affordable housing for every American family, recognizing that housing is more than shelter. It provides significant social and economic benefits. So the US has a shortage of safe, decent, and affordable housing. And part of the problem is there are too few skilled construction workers to help address it. So today, 4 experts are joining us to explore the skilled worker landscape and efforts to address shortages and worker upskilling. We also hope to touch on the role that policymakers and those in the sector can play to attract new entrants to worker upskilling and to the careers that are actually here. So we're going to kick things off with a presentation from Ed Brady, CEO and President of the Home Builders Institute, and a frequent partner with us on issues related to employment and immigration. He will set the scene for a description of labor in home building. Ed, thank you.
Thanks, Erica, and it's a pleasure to be here back with the BPC, which I served on the Housing Policy Commission many years ago with a number of fellows at the center, and including Ron Terwilliger. So it's a real pleasure to be here with Ron Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy, and honored to be here with the panel of experts. I'll just kind of set the stage if I could. As a home builder for 32 years, I know the importance of quality skilled labor. And in 2018, I came, after serving with the National Association of Home Builders leadership, came to the Home Builders Institute, which historically over 50 years has trained skilled labor in the construction trades in residential construction. And I came because I understand the importance of providing housing supply takes labor. In fact, in my 30 years, 40% of the cost of a house that I built, 40% of it is labor. And so it's a huge amount of the overall retail cost. And so not only labor affects the production, it affects the cost. And so when you talk about affordability and supply, they kind of meld together when you talk about labor. So I have for the last 3 years talked about the challenge that we have with the labor force. And back in January, February, I came out and said, we're at a crisis level. And I'm going to show why we're at a crisis level in the construction labor force of skilled labor in a second. And I just want to kind of set the picture of what I think our panelists are going to talk about, and that is that this is at a crisis level that's going to take a collaborative effort with government, public enterprise, associations, leadership in Congress to make an impact on what is a very long runway to improve the labor force and to provide the housing supply that we need in this country. And so if you'll I've got a series of short series of slides. If you'll bring those slides up, I'll kind of set the table for the panelists to hopefully agree with where we are as far as a crisis situation and why we're in this crisis and how we may be able to impact the crisis over a period of time. So if you go to the next slide, the construction job openings, which we monitor all the time, and I commission NHB's economics department, asked them to create what we have is on a annual 2 times a year basis, come up with the construction labor report. And in October, in May of this year, early June, we had our most recent report. It shows 434,000 open jobs in the construction industry. 434,000. That's a big gap to fill. At the Home Builders Institute, we train 7,000 to 10,000 students a year, and we place 80 to 85% of those in the industry. And when you talk about the scale of 400,000 empty jobs, we're making a tiny impact, and we need to collaborate with a number of HBIs, unions, labor, other associations, plumbers associations. All these associations need to collaborate to try and get the legislative approach and the policymakers to understand the crisis that we're in and to invest not in infrastructure, in human infrastructure. I always say that if you have shovel-ready projects, but you have nobody to run the shovel, it's going to remain silent and we're not going to improve. And that's the same with the housing supply in this country. So if you look at the historic openings, it certainly goes down during the recessions, which as we potentially enter into a recession this year or in the near future, I contend that we shouldn't let up the gas, let the foot off the pedal in training, because this is a long runway. In fact, that's where we have the opportunity to make up some of that gap. But why is the gap there? Over the last 20 to 30 years, we haven't invested in this industry. In fact, everybody has pushed people into, not everybody, but society has pushed people into four-year universities, into higher education. And at the high school level, at the secondary school level, we have taken those opportunities to introduce people to something beyond high school that doesn't include a four-year degree or even a two-year degree, that includes on-the-job training, that includes a career path right out of high school that can be a lifelong career path. And so the crisis is that we've got 400,000 empty jobs. And you also see on slide, if you move to the next slide, you'll see the workers, the wages for residential construction is trending up. But I also contend that in order to compete with the market, you're hearing of Target and Starbucks paying $17 an hour for an air conditioner. We were talking earlier about the heat wave that has attacked our country. Without air conditioning, outside work is tough work. So we have to compete with those Starbucks and Targets and other retailers that are paying higher wages. And we see our wages in the residential construction ticking up. But we also need to look at what stability we offer in our industry, in the residential side. We need to look at the business model that contractors are working under so that we can be competitive and offer benefits, offer stability. As a carpenter, many times you're getting paid by the hour. You lose 3-4 weeks out of the year because of rain. You can't be outside. And so you may be making a good wage, but you're only working 46, 48 weeks out of the year. So we have to think through that collectively as to see how we can do that. How do you pay more? You create more productivity. You train people in a quality way that they can produce at a faster pace, at a better quality pace, and you can afford to pay. I often say, if you have a carpentry crew that can frame a house in 2 weeks and you're paying them $15 an hour. If they frame it in 1 week, you can afford to pay them $22, $25 an hour and make the same wage and the cost the same, so that you make sure that you're still building affordability. So we are trending higher, but we've got some work to do on that. If you move to the next page, and when I talk about productivity, I talk about how we've invested. In fact, productivity as a country has gone up 48% overall. In the construction industry, it's only gone up 12%. And why is that? Part of that is that we're not putting quality training into our workforce. The Great Recession is a huge cause of what is lagging to be creating this crisis. We lost a lot of the people in our industry during the Great Recession in housing. People left to find new careers. They retired early and never came back. And we weren't investing and introducing people into the industry to create the housing that we need. And so we start from that gap, and prior to that, still pushing people into four-year universities, taking shop class. If you look at my haircut, you can tell I was shop class back then. It's now career technical education. But we divested in shop class in career technical education. So we lost a generation of young people entering our industry. So in fact, for every 2 that are entering our industry today, 5 are leaving the industry through retirements or through other career changes or so forth. So our productivity is going to continue to go down before it goes up if we could reinvest in this and reinvest in the skilled labor. If you go just as a highlight of kind of the next slide, our report came out and said that there were 7.7 million workers in the construction industry, 3.2 in the residential side. And in fact, over the next 3 years, we need to fill a gap of 740,000 construction workers each year for the next 3 years. Over 2.2 million shortfall of what we're going to need to keep up with the production and the housing needs that are needed in this country. That's a big lift when you talk about HBI, one of the largest residential construction training entities, doing 7,000 to 10,000. Now we're training 7,000 to 10,000 directly, but we are now into 250 schools, back into the schools. And so we're touching 20,000 to 25,000 students now, not all that are going to go into the construction industry, but at least have a leg up, have the information, that have the introduction to an industry that gives them an opportunity to not think about what 4-year universities look like or 2-year universities, that they can jump right into a career path in the construction industry. Keep in mind, 22% of our workforce is self-employed. That provides entrepreneurship opportunities. That provides people independence of being an employee to an employer. And so in the residential construction side, it's not only a career path to a good job, it's a very high potential career path to entrepreneurship and to owning your own business and creating jobs instead of just being an employee. I think some will touch on immigration. The immigration policy in this country needs to be improved, to be reformed. At one point, we were over 30% of our workforce was immigrants, and that is declining every year. So that means we have to be more cognizant of investing in our human infrastructure here in this country. Finally, 41 is the median age for a construction worker. I think the average age of a plumber is in the late 50s, meaning if we don't invest, we're not going to have plumbers to take care of our infrastructure or our new construction. And then almost 70% of our workforce is in between 25 and 54. So we need to bring young people into this. We need to retain those people that are in the industry to make sure that we have that pipeline. And I'll finish with this, that construction is construction. our industry is full of different opportunities, from commercial, industrial, to residential, to infrastructure, all of those different things. And I contend that if we don't all come together, and this is what I saw Senator Dole's comment earlier about Republican or Democrat, residential or commercial, industrial, union or non-union. If we don't all come together and talk about how to resolve this problem, to bring more people into the pipeline, and we're a pre-apprenticeship. We don't have an apprenticeship program, but we, as a residential, are a pipeline for all kinds of different jobs in this construction industry. And so Nicole and I were talking very briefly before, if we don't come together and talk about solutions that fill the pipeline in the construction industry, frankly, we're not going to be able to provide affordable housing, and we're not going to be able to provide housing for those in need, in this country's needs, to provide a safe environment for all to live. And so that kind of sets the stage of the crisis that is going on, Erica, in the home building industry and in the construction industry. And residential is not alone. I'm sure Nicole's going to hit on this as well, that the commercial and industrial, manufacturing, truck drivers, we're all under the same kind of pressure to provide a workforce, to provide the product that we need. And I contend that if we don't all work together, we will not solve this problem. So I'll stop there. Erica?
Ed, thank you so much for your presentation. That was a great scene setter. I just wanted to add it at any time, please feel free to add a comment or question in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube or Zoom, or also tweet at BPC Partisan, so at BPC_bipartisan, or using hashtag BPC Live. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harry Holzer. He is a professor of public policy at Georgetown, and he's going to give us an overview of labor market challenges and opportunities. So thank you, Dr. Holzer.
Thank you, Erica. It's nice to be here. I also have a few slides, not nearly as good as the ones Ed showed. And I'm mostly going to reinforce what Ed said from a labor economics, labor markets point of view. So if we could have the slides. There we go. So next slide, please. So the first question, economists always say, well, how do we know for sure there's a shortage? Yeah, Ed said, 434,000 jobs. That sounds like a lot, but does that really indicate, there's always some vacancies in every industry, and at every point in time, there's always some people leaving and new jobs opening up. How do we know that's a big number? It turns out it is for construction. So 434,000 out of something over 7 million employees, that's a 5.5% job vacancy rate. Now, is that big or small? Well, it turns out the national average over the last year has been about 7%. So the 5.5% is not high relative to other industries, but it is high relative to construction, right? Industries are different. Construction's a fairly stable industry when you're not in recession. It doesn't have a lot of turnover. So you can't, comparing construction to other industries, a little bit of apples and oranges. You want to look at construction compared to its own history. And it turns out there, the norm historically has been more in the 2 to 3 to 4% vacancy rate. So 5.5% is high for construction. And that suggests, and by the way, that's a combination of residential and commercial, unskilled and skilled, et cetera. But the overall number is pretty high. But the other thing, economists like to look at wages. And if you've ever taken any econ, they beat you over the head with this idea. If there's a shortage, it raises prices. If there's a labor shortage, it should raise wages, and have the wages been going up. And I think what's particularly interesting here, by far, the shortage issues are more about skilled versus unskilled labor. So if you have a shortage of skilled workers, that gap in wages should be rising over time, and it has. Overall, if you look at the published numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the overall, and I'm going to look at medians, not mean numbers. Medians is the 50% point. It's more informative. On average, about $23 an hour. And you see a little question mark on my slide. The only problem is that when BLS looks at the overall numbers, they combine construction and mining or extracting occupations. So it blurs the image a little bit, but it's mostly construction. And 23 is pretty close to that's a nationwide average across all categories, all regions. But if you break it down into skilled versus unskilled, you see a gap that's widened over time. In the national data, if you look at fairly unskilled construction jobs, laborers, helpers, they're all about $17 to $18 an hour, which is not that high compared to, as Ed said, you're starting to see 15 and McDonald's and Starbucks and places like that. Skilled craftsmen, on average, electricians, plumbers, nationwide numbers mostly come in about $30 an hour right now. So that's a pretty good sized gap. That means that the average skilled craftsman earns 2/3 or more than the average unskilled. But of course, if you look in more detail, some of the more specialty categories in certain places, you look at frontline supervisors, the numbers get considerably above 30, 35 to 40 or more is not unusual. So it really does suggest that there's a shortage of skilled workers. So now that Ed and I agree on that, next slide. What's causing this? Now I'm an economist, right? So I immediately go to supply and demand, what we call the fundamentals. And I think the fundamentals do, in fact, support this notion. And I've separated supply, the first set of categories, from demand. So the basic supply issue is demographic. And Ed talked about this. A lot of the skilled craftsmen are concentrated in our generation, the baby boomer generation. They are on the verge or have been retiring. And immigrants have been increasingly taking their place. How many jobs for immigrants? 25 to 30% are the numbers that I see. A chunk of those folks are undocumented. And in fact, construction is the biggest employer of undocumented immigrants in the United States today, more than agriculture, more than hospitality. So half or more of those immigrants are undocumented, and that's relevant because it's for a lot of different reasons. Undocumented immigrants are going to get less skills training. But there are a few other things going on besides that. A lot of people going to college, as Ed said. These days, 75 to 80% of high school grads go to college. And college grads tend not to be that interested in construction. They view it the same way they view manufacturing, an old-fashioned blue collar, and even though the jobs have changed a lot. So, and the other thing about the 20 to 30% that are not going to college tend not to be your best students, the students with the strongest basic skills. There might be other issues there. So it's harder simply to find the folks willing to do this as a career. And gender matters too. In college, almost 60% of undergrads in America are women right now. Women turn out to be better than men at sitting in a classroom and taking tests and things like that. And for women, the traditional image of construction is really unappealing in a lot of cases. So a lot of supply side factors. The decline of unionized construction matters as well, because historically, unions ran apprenticeship programs. And it often made sense. Small contractors, it's hard for small contractors to set up these expensive training programs. So unions ran the apprenticeship programs. As the fraction of unionized employment in the industry has declined, it's now down to, I think, 12, 13% of the whole industry. There's been a big hole of who's going to run those. And I think NBI and other organizations have tried to fill that hole, but it matters. And then what's the demand side look like? Well, demand, we've had a great cycling of demand in the last 20 years, boom to bust to boom. Had a big boom, it looked like a bubble until about 2006. When that burst and the economy went into recession, demand really nosedived. As I said, a lot of workers left the industry. Some came back, some didn't. But then over time, that demand recovered. And during the pandemic and post-pandemic time, the demand really strengthened a lot. So demand is now very strong. And we haven't even gotten into the new infrastructure, the new infrastructure bill that was passed and signed by President Biden last year will add a lot more construction jobs, a lot more commercial perhaps, but it'll still affect the residential market. So there'll be very strong demand chasing weakening supply of skilled workers, and that seems to be the problem. So last slide, what are a few of the policy levers we can think about for trying to increase that supply of these skilled workers that Ed talked about? I just list three. It's not necessarily the conclusive set. Number one, community colleges. as well as their for-profit counterparts. Community colleges, the associate degree programs in construction are mostly about construction management, the business end of construction, but a lot of the certificate programs do cover skilled construction work and HVAC and electrical work and things like that. So in both the public and the private sides. And by the way, then we could also add in here some of the for-profit colleges and some of the other programs, such as the NBI programs. Apprenticeship, of course, is very important. Historically, that's been unionized, but there is increasing non-union versions of apprenticeship. Another important controversy is whether all of the apprenticeship should be registered. And in the Trump administration, there was a push for non-registered apprenticeship, the IRAP program. We can talk about the benefits and costs of those different approaches, but apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship and other versions of work-based learning. And finally, one other thing, in high school career and tech ed, construction and architecture is one of the 16 career clusters that the Department of Education has emphasized. Within that career cluster, there's several different career pathways. And perhaps at that point, we're not doing as good a job as communicating to students that there are potentially lucrative careers here that need to be looked at. So we can press on all those different levers in different ways. There's funding issues. One of the funding problems, for instance, is that if it's a not-for-credit certificate, you can't get a Pell Grant. You can't get any Title IV aid. Sometimes people want to expand that Pell category to include not-for-credit stuff. There's big arguments about that. If you're going to expand funding, you also have to have measures of accountability to make sure that the funding is spent appropriately. But anyway, we'll put all those on the table. I'll stop here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Harry. Next, I would like to introduce Nicole Schwartz. She is the coordinator for the Apprenticeship Readiness Program at the North America's Building Trades Union. Nicole.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I think the thing that would probably be most beneficial for me to focus on here is the Apprenticeship Readiness Program. Our Apprenticeship Readiness Program, a lot of people commonly refer them to pre-apprenticeship programs. We choose Apprenticeship Readiness because our program is designed to prepare anyone for work in any of the 14 trades that we work with at North America's Building Trades Unions. And we are really focusing on kind of a lot of the things that have already been mentioned, especially as it refers to providing young people with an opportunity to have a career that can really open up the opportunities to a whole variety of roles. And I think the best example we have right now is Secretary Walsh, who, for the Department of Labor, who is a card-carrying member of the Laborers International Union of North America. And, you know, he started as a laborer, and I think that's something that's really important to focus for people, is that, you know, you can sit in a room like this once you start in a career in construction. You can work on a job site, you can be an entrepreneur and start your own contracting business, you can be a safety inspector. There's a lot of different options. And I think it's up to us to kind of change the narrative about what our careers look like and change kind of how people view them as good or bad or temporary or permanent. And it's a very rewarding career path that not only can be lucrative in terms of pension and pay, but also, you know, we're literally building our communities, from our housing stock to stadiums to offshore wind to green construction to nuclear plants. The options are just endless, and I think it's really up to us to kind of change that narrative for young people. And high school is really important, that, you know, that we need to get to high school as soon as we can, but I think it's even more important to get into students in elementary and middle school, because a lot of decisions for young people are made earlier than we even expect them to be. So if a child decides in middle school that they don't want to work in construction, it might be very hard to convince them otherwise. So, you know, we work a lot with the American School Counselors Association, in addition to career and technical educators across the country, to really help expand their knowledge of what it means to work in the trade so that they can present the best case for not only students, but parents. And I think that's part of what we have to do too. We have to get through to parents that this is a career path that can support families and to be honest, change the trajectory of families across the country. And I'm very excited to be here, Erica. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Nicole. Finally, we are going to have Mr. Nick Gerton, who is Associate Director at Coalfield Development at Rural Appalachia. So Nick, can you briefly describe your organization's role in economic development in Appalachia and how that ties in with the skilled workforce discussion?
Sure, absolutely, Erica. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. As Erica mentioned, I'm the Associate Director for Revitalize Appalachia, which is the licensed general contractor and real estate development arm of Coalfield Development Corporation in Southern West Virginia. And our work really focuses on cultivating inclusive community development across the southern counties that we serve here in West Virginia. And really, we're focusing on growing diversified, people-centric local economies. And I'll especially talk a little bit about our workforce development approach as it relates to the work of our team, which is both construction and then also we work in affordable housing as well. So if we could go ahead and pull up the slides. Great. So I think it would be helpful to start the organization was founded 12 years ago by our CEO, Brandon Dennison. And originally the organization had a focus specifically on affordable housing with, an understanding and a witnessing of the fact that there was a lot of affordability issues in the rural communities that we were looking to serve. And as that understanding grew, part of it was also the fact that there were very few well-paying jobs in the communities where we were working. And so it wasn't just a housing supply issue, but also an economic opportunity issue as well. And so the programs that we've cultivated really have grown out of that initial understanding around the fact that we're working at the nexus of both economic development and workforce development. And so I want to offer just a little context first. So we're working, as I mentioned, in Southern West Virginia. We're working in extremely small communities, often very rural in nature, all throughout the southern coalfields. So you can see, this geographic service area that we cover, spans everything from mid to, semi-large industrial centers and post-industrial centers down to very small rural communities and county seats. Ultimately, we're covering a geographic area that is larger than the state of Rhode Island, just in the communities where we work. Again, so I want to just talk a little bit about from a expectation setting standpoint, we're working in rural communities where overwhelmingly the economy and the workforce have been geared towards extractive monoeconomies. So, that is both a reality and then also the difference that we're trying to make here. So, our statewide workforce participation rate is second lowest in the country at 54.2%. We're still dealing with persistently high rates of intergenerational poverty and deep public health challenges. And we're working in areas that have been historically geared towards extraction of natural resources, which means that our business activity, industries, and employers are overwhelmingly geared towards several large industries. So when we talk about the work that this organization does, it's not just around the workforce diversification and upskilling, but also diversification of the local economy and the industries there specifically. So how do we do that? So with the team that I work on specifically, we're working through a program that employs people in paid on-the-job training programs, and we cater those programs for people facing long-term barriers to employment. So that could be anything from people who've worked in industries that are historically no longer economically viable and are transitioning out where most employees can no longer find jobs in those industries. We're working with people who face discrimination, whether that's racism, gender discrimination, people who are experiencing trauma, who are in recovery, or who are transitioning out of the criminal justice system. And our program specifically is not just about training, it's about creating paid on-the-job training opportunities for people. And that includes both work on actual real job sites, as well as hours each week geared towards higher education and personal development. So each week, a person that's taking part in the Coalfield program could specifically expect to work on the job in an industry that they're being trained in, alongside also going to either a local community college, a local career or vocational tech center, and then engaging in group guided mentorship and personal activities, including financial empowerment, journaling. The sort of experiences can vary, but we're doing this specifically in the construction team where I lead on projects that include affordable housing. So people who are learning construction skills, everything from carpentry, framing, envelope work with installing new windows, doors, insulation, they're doing those on real projects, and they're doing them on projects in the communities that they serve. And I think I'll get a little bit more into that when we talk a bit later here in the event, specifically around some lessons learned. But I think that's all I'll share for now, Erica. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much. And as a reminder, please feel free to add a comment or question in the chat if you're watching live on YouTube, or tweet at BPC_bipartisan, or using our hashtag BPC Live. I have a few questions prepared, but I also have started getting in questions. So I will turn to those questions to our panelist. So our first question asked, the 2008 market collapse caused skilled labor to leave the industry. How can these jobs be made more stable to future downturns? Ed and Nicole, I think I'll turn to you first. And Ed, you're on mute.
I would say this, a lot of our contractors, as I was a home builder, did both service and new construction. They did remodel and repair. And even during a downturn, our industry can, in the home sales or in a housing crisis, which actually was a financial crisis, not necessarily a housing crisis, turned into a housing crisis, but caused by the financial sector. I'm putting blame on that. It was more of a financial crisis, but I think there's still a lot of service-oriented jobs. There's a lot of apartment building in affordable housing. There's a maintenance and repair and remodeling industry. There's government industry on infrastructure. When government when there's a recession, government seems to put more money into the infrastructure. And so but you're right. We have to create some stability in that industry. It's a cyclical business. There is no answer to the cyclical cycle of the home building industry, because it comes and goes with recessions. It comes and goes with the economy. So we have to build that sustainability in paying well, in offering benefits, in that sustainability of an employer that doesn't take the winter off because it's a hard winter, that is getting paid on an annual basis and a week by week basis, a salary basis, if you will, so that they can build that sustainability and they're not living paycheck to paycheck. So we have some work to do in the industry from our perspective in order to create that. But in the Great Recession, we lost a lot of people, and in the pandemic, we lost a lot of people that didn't want to be work. And it's on the job work. You're working side by side with a lot of people, and so both of those contributed to early retirements or jobs that didn't involve hands-on work. So we need to build that sustainability as an industry.
Yeah, I would also comment that I think most recently the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is really going to help us kind of bring some stability to the market. We don't have to have an infrastructure week moving forward because we have the infrastructure bill that we were looking for. the public investment can kind of help us smooth out those bumps in the roads as kind of, as we deal with recessions or just downturns in spending, private spending. From our angle when it comes to our apprenticeship readiness programs, we also really try to make sure that people understand that there is a cyclical nature to the construction industry. And we include a financial literacy piece in our curriculum so that we can help people have the tools that they need to save for those instances where the winter is hard or it rains a whole bunch and you can't work on the job. And also to know that that's that there could be booms and busts, and that's something that they can expect. But this infrastructure bill can really help us smooth that out moving forward.
Thank you. We had another question, and I think Ed, you briefly talked about this, and it's about how construction jobs are physically demanding in terms of being outdoors, hot, cold weather. And what do the panelists think the value of technology is towards attracting workers by alleviating those conditions? And Nick, West Virginia is also a 4-season climate. So how are you guys working with that?
I guess I'll say, maybe this is similar to the point that Ed was making earlier, which is that, construction jobs and projects can vary, quite a bit. And so a lot of our projects actually are often adaptive reuse or renovation projects, and that can be preservation of housing. It can be preserving a vacant building and returning it to productive use. And so seasonality, can be worked with and accommodated when you're staggering the types of work that are happening inside structures. The intensity and type of work can vary. And then also just understanding from our standpoint as both an employer that works in the construction industry and the client as a developer, that there's going to have to be certain accommodations we make when things like weather gets too extreme, which is happening more often, and just trying to juggle the schedule and the tasks that our crews are working on as much as possible to accommodate those things.
If I could jump in on that, just to add to that, what economists believe is that seasonal jobs, all things equal, have to pay them, because the seasonality of the industry might be something that dissuades some workers from entering the industry. And so the wages have to be higher to attract those people back. And that's part of the reason that skilled craftspeople, in that $30 to $40 an hour range, some of that is because of the seasonality. And of course, it's that plus any unemployment insurance that workers will get when they are seasonally laid off. For the unemployment insurance system is a bit of a mess, right? And it hasn't been maintained well, and people struggled with the system during the pandemic. So I think we can invest in improving that system. But if you combine the wages and benefits offered plus the unemployment insurance benefits, that accounts or makes up for some of the seasonality that might turn workers off, and potential workers need to understand that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very insightful, especially about the relationship with wages. So Harry, would like to talk a little bit more about the construction worker component of the immigration. I think you and Ed both talked about how declines in immigration have impacted, or trends in immigration patterns have impacted the industry. Can you talk a little bit more about what are the national trends? What are you seeing? What policies do you think are needed to maybe address these issues?
Well, so there has been a decline in immigration. The declines really coinciding after the 2016 election. They were very small, and then in the pandemic, the decline became much larger, and then has been bouncing back during the recovery from the pandemic. As I sort of said, about 25 to 30% of construction workers nationwide are immigrants, and a big chunk of those folks are undocumented. We would like to have fewer people in the industry be undocumented, because that creates barriers to upskilling for a lot of different reasons. Undocumented immigrants, even immigrants who are here legally, there are often language issues that conflict with skill acquisition, things like that. and if you're undocumented, folks don't want to get noticed a lot. So there's, I think, a greater reluctance to be in the industry, and the conversation has become so hostile towards immigrants, and that's not helping either. On the policy front, look, a rational immigration policy, I think, would do two things. With baby boomers retiring, with very low native-born population growth, we need more immigrants to make our economy grow. Very simply, we need more immigrants. But I also think immigration could be tilted a little more towards economic need. If you set aside refugees, so sort of there's two pathways in immigration. One is based on family unification, and that remains 60 to 7% of all immigration. And then there's the ones based on economic need, the different visa categories, H1, H2, et cetera. I would like to see the system tilt more in the direction of economic need. And I think, frankly, it would be a better political selling point. I think too many politicians emphasize the moral story of immigration, but I think we have a raw economic need for immigrants, and in particular in this industry. So that's where I think we want the conversation to go. Immigration is important for economic growth and for the health of industries like construction. How do we get a more economically oriented immigration system that I think would be easier to sell to the American public and would address the sort of growing acuteness of the shortage here?
And Eric, if I could, I agree. I agree with that. And nobody wants to hire an undocumented immigrant to work. It's better to oops. That's not my office. Anyway, I lost my train of thought. But so in immigration reform, I also agree that the immigration visas are based on, right, like high skilled labor.
Can we mute that?
Okay. I contend that we're not allowing enough visas for skilled construction labor. Harry mentioned the gap between skilled labor, and it's a huge gap. And the only way we're going to increase our productivity is to create more skilled labor. And a lot of the immigrant labor is skilled. And so we need to allow a path for them to come into the industry. And that takes immigration reform on a bipartisan level. And when Harry talks about economics, if you talk about affordable housing and it takes 9 months to build a house instead of 4 months to build a house, the cost continues to go up. And if you have to pay somebody a high wage at a lower productivity level, then the cost goes up. And so we have to bring immigration into the system. However, given that, and the administrative changes from year over year, or Congress changes, or the administration changes, we can't count on immigration labor. That's why we have to invest in our American infrastructure, human infrastructure, to bring young people into this industry, to create that pipeline of career professionals.
Thank you, Ed. I have a question from the audience as well, and it ties in with one that I had also had, and that was about labor mobility. And so are you seeing a mismatch in between the labor pools and projects, and in particular any parts of the country? And following up with that, for instance, Canada has what they call the Ellis chart. It's a database that describes the licensure or certification process in each of their Canadian provinces. Are there similar databases, or a similar database in the US? And is it helpful, or are these steps that states could take to increase labor mobility?
I think that's a very important issue. Really, over time, the mobility of the American worker has actually declined, which then impedes this process that we're talking about. And economists kind of arguing with each other about why it's going down. Part of the thing actually has to do with the cost of housing in some metro areas. Like if you can't afford to move to certain areas, you're not going to move there to find jobs there. So it's a little bit circular. I don't think we have great data on this. It would be good data to have, but I think that also means that when we're teaching, well, we need better data on where job opportunities exist at any point in time, and we need to make them available to workers. So for instance, we have these one-stop shops all over the country for unemployed workers to go to. That would be a good place for people to get information about labor mobility. But in other ways, it has, it can be online, but that would be very good information for people to have, along with assistance, maybe certain kinds of assistance to help people with the daunting tasks that are sometimes involved from moving from one region to another to chase the jobs. And like I said, getting housing costs under control would help that as well.
I'll just chime in here and say that from our perspective, we're really focused on the national program standards for apprenticeship through the Department of Labor. Those national program standards make it very easy for our members to travel from local to local, and that can benefit them, not only if that's something that they're interested to do, but they also still retain all their pension credits for the time worked, and that follows them from local to local. And for a contractor, if they need a cement mason and they hire a cement mason from the local in their area, they know that they've been trained to a certain standard. And if it's the national program standards, then they know that if it's a cement mason from Milwaukee or a cement mason from New York City, they've been trained under the same quality standards. And that portability really makes it easy for people to get a job in a new place when they move.
Yeah, I just say I agree with Nicole, and as Harry said earlier, credentialing is similar in the sense that if you have an industry recognized credential, it's portable, it's transient, if you will, and so I think we need to stick with that type of standardization or standards that we train by, and then that's portable and transition.
Okay, great. So Nick, I want to turn to you and talk a little more about Coalfield. So you link worker development and economic development in the communities that you serve. And could you share how your model works and what elements might be most transferable to other communities or other organizations that are looking to do this?
Sure, yeah. And I think it probably ties in a little bit to this discussion as well about mobility and opportunity. One thing that we prioritize when we talk about supporting people with barriers to employment is identifying what those barriers can be. So a lot of the folks who are in our various workforce programs are dealing with like very fundamental things like getting a driver's license reinstated, or figuring out how to navigate the obligations of a parole system, working with local criminal justice representatives, right? So part of our program from the outset is really supporting people in tackling those barriers, right? Because you're not going to be able to do the more technical skill-based work unless there's this holistic approach to like what the entire person really needs. And so we take a very holistic approach when we work with people, because you have to think about the needs that a person has beyond just the job upskilling component in our perspective. And so we also look at that from the standpoint of cultivating job training opportunities in communities where there are high rates of unemployment, or there are high rates of intergenerational poverty. And so we're bringing, as a real estate developer, we're bringing projects into communities that are then turning around and employing people who can learn construction skills, construction work opportunities on the job for that project. So we're not necessarily establishing a program in one place and then expecting people from throughout our service area to come to it. We're instead bringing that work and that opportunity to the communities that we serve, because we recognize that the nature of a lot of the challenges that we talk about in workforce development are both geographic and deeply interpersonal. And so that really does inform our philosophy as both a workforce training entity, but also as an employer. I think I do really want to stress that, like, as a general contractor and as a developer, we are subject to a lot of the same imperatives and forces that people in the private sector are. And we're finding ways to work with the people that we employ in these training programs because we put that as an equally important priority alongside schedule, budget, return. So.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to Nicole and Ed. And so both the National Association of the North American Building Trades Unions and the Home Builders Institute have focused on increasing diversity of workers represented in the skilled trades. There was a recent Baltimore Sun article that listed that 36% of teen girls are familiar with the trades and only 48% think that it's a good career option compared to 63% of teen boys. Could you talk a little bit about your organization's efforts and the industry's efforts to attract more women and people of color to apprenticeship programs? What seems to be working? What are some of the outcomes?
Yeah, I'll get started here. That's the exact reason that we developed the Apprenticeship Readiness Program about a decade ago, a little bit earlier than that, to diversify the pipeline of people who are qualified to enter the skilled trades. And we've found, I think I kind of talked at the beginning about convincing young girls. And I think the idea is that you need to have two strategies here. You need a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. So the long-term strategy is really to get in front of middle schoolers and elementary school students and kind of talk to them about the options of careers in construction. But the short-term strategy is how do we bring down barriers right now to people who are looking for jobs in the trades. One area that we've noted in particular has been childcare, especially as it pertains to getting women into the skilled trades. So we are working on a childcare pilot that we just started in 2 cities. We have not much information to share, but know that this is a place that we really want to do some work because we need to figure out how to get more women on the work site. And I think it also is casting a wide net, not just a mile wide, but also a mile deep so that you really are getting to people in the communities who've never heard about the building trades. And I think that also includes, like Nick said, working with the formerly incarcerated and the justice impacted. We do a lot of work in that space. And we've had pretty good outcomes consistently. Participants in our program are 80% people from communities of color and about 25% women. And we're always kind of looking at how we can increase that number of women. But 25% women in a cohort is significantly higher than the current number of women who are working in the trade. So we're working on how we can actively change that, but know that it's something that we're very dedicated to at this point in time.
I just add, Erica, great question. And it's a huge opportunity for the industry because the underserved populations do not know about the industry. They don't know the opportunity that they have, nor have they been, frankly, given the opportunity. And people of color, and especially women who I think 10 or 12% of the construction workforce is women, about 3 or 4% of those in the trades. And as Harry said, 52% of the population is women. And if we're not bringing women into our industry, we have a real challenge. And so we're working with groups like She Build, the house that She Built. We're working with 100 Black Men of America. And we're putting training programs to introduce to young people of color and young people, women, to accept the idea that there's a career path for them. The second thing that we're trying to do is teach the industry how to treat women in the industry. There has been a historical challenge for women in the industry. This is personal to me because my daughter took over my construction company, and contractors kept calling me over the top of her because they didn't respect her knowledge in the industry or her experience in the industry. And she ended up leaving the business. And so I think we need to welcome women into the industry, but we need to also teach existing people in the industry how to treat women. Locker room talk is not necessarily it's not acceptable. There's no comfort. And so that's a roadblock for women to get into the industry. And finally, we're in prisons. We're training in the prison system and giving opportunity for those that have served their time. When they get out, they have a meaningful career path and a skill that they can be productive in society. And the recidivism, I don't have the statistics on me, but this recidivism rate, somebody coming out of incarceration.
Sorry, Ed, I'm going to have to cut you off there. We're running out of time. But it just goes to show you just how interesting this conversation has been. So I just want to thank you all for participating, and we will be having another session in September to be announced. So thank you all for participating today, and thank you to my panelists.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.